This video will help you understand which property is considered separate versus joint for the purposes of your estate plan. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. When constructing your estate plan, of course, it's important to figure out who you want to get which assets when you're gone. Equally as important, though, is making sure that you've done all the appropriate logistics ahead of time to ensure that those wishes are fulfilled. And this includes things like titling accounts appropriately. And it's not long before Googling the appropriate way to title accounts to make sure your wishes are fulfilled that you start getting seemingly contradictory advice and also state-specific guidance on what you should do. The reason that this confusion is so frustrating is because if you don't title your accounts appropriately, you don't use them in the appropriate fashion, it's quite possible that the heirs you want to get the money may or may not get the money in the most tax-efficient way possible. So in today's video, we'll help you figure out how to apply your specific state statutes and how you can title your assets appropriately so that the loved ones you want to get the money or to get these assets get them in the most tax-efficient way possible. So let's jump in. From the outset, I want to clarify that this is by no means legal advice, and while a lot of what we talk about is applicable when it comes to divorce planning, there's a bit more nuance there and we'd have to take a deeper dive at that point. Specifically, our focus today is not on divorce, it's on death. And when I refer to property and assets in this video, I'm referring to non-qualified assets. So these are basically all assets outside of tax-qualified or tax-sheltered retirement type accounts, 401ks, IRAs, etc. Those have their own titling conventions, and very simply, we know how these generally are going to transfer to your loved ones. You're not going to get a step up in basis, and there's usually a beneficiary designation, so that's who gets the money. So to figure out what's going to happen with your non-qualified assets when you die, we first want to figure out whether you are in a separate property state or a community property state. Separate property states are also referred to oftentimes as common law states. That's how I was educated in the business in referring to these states. But I guess technically they're called separate property states that fall under estate common law rules. Hence the confusion. To keep it simple, when we refer to things, we're just going to call them separate property states or community property states. But just know if you see the word common law state, what they're referring to is, in this video, what we call a separate property state. So step one is to figure out which of these two types of states you're in. To keep it simple, community property states are the following, which means if you're not in one of these states, then you are in a separate property state. So the community property states are Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin. I'll also link to a map down below for a quick reference. Specifically for those in California, Nevada, and Washington state, there's some further nuance as it pertains to whether or not you are in a domestic partnership, which is not an official marriage, but it's two people living together, sharing expenses, etc. We're not going to dive deep into that, but just know there's a little bit of nuance there, even if you're not married. I also want to carve out a slight exception for Alaska. Alaska is technically a separate property state. However, spouses can choose to have their estate run as if it was a community property state. You're allowed the choice. So now that we've figured out which state you're in, separate or community property state, now let's find out how that state will determine who owns which assets between you and your spouse. Of course, if you're single, you own all your assets, so there's not much confusion there. But if you're married, or in those other states we talked about, a domestic partnership, then there's some further nuance to the titling of your accounts and the use of your accounts that you're going to want to be aware of. First, let's touch on how separate property states view ownership titling, because it's the simplest to understand and it applies to the majority of states out there. So in a separate property state, regardless of who acquired the property when, either before or after marriage, all property is either going to be owned by one spouse, the other spouse, or it's going to be considered owned as joint. And that's all going to come down to how you title those assets. When it comes to jointly held assets, so like a joint investment account or a joint checking account, the state is going to consider each spouse owning 50% of that asset. And that's important to remember when we come back to this in a little bit. As it pertains to community property states, on the other hand, things get a little bit more tricky. Community property states further break things down into either separately held property or community held property. Separately held property, for the most part, is all property that you acquired before you got married and that was maintained as not commingled, meaning it was maintained as separate property throughout your marriage, it was maintained as separate, and you didn't commingle those funds with joint funds, you didn't use them for joint ventures, it was maintained as just a totally separate silo. In addition, even if you are married, you can still accumulate more separately held property in two main ways. One is through some type of gift or inheritance, For example, like a life insurance proceed that went to you as the beneficiary. As long as you maintain that in a separate account, that's considered separate property. The second way is any separate property you came into the marriage with that was further used to acquire even more separate property. So for example, let's say one spouse owns ownership in like a business or a family limited partnership of some kind. Even though that spouse gets married, as long as the distributions from that family limited partnership or that business interest are used to acquire more property, and again, none of that property is commingled with the spouse, that could also be considered separate property. This is also why it's very common for folks that come into marriages with lots of different assets and resources to look into implementing a prenuptial agreement, also known as a prenup. Now, if you have nothing, or in my case, when you got married, you came into the marriage with negative nothing, then it's probably not going to really make sense for you to waste your money and time on getting a prenup done. But for other folks who might come into a marriage far more established than I did, it might make sense to have a prenup in place. So that's how community property states define separate property. Let's look at how community property states define community property. So simply defined, that's any property that was acquired during the marriage, or property that was acquired before the marriage that then was commingled. So for example, if you came into the marriage with a large, brokerage account or investment account of some kind, and then you used that account or you retitled it as joint with your spouse, and you two use that money for groceries and things like that, though it'd be titled either as yourself or joint, those proceeds are effectively being used for the community, and so the community property state is going to see that as a community property asset. Generally, jointly titled property like homes and investment accounts are going to be considered community property. Now, community property states view community property as being 100% owned and maintained by each spouse individually. So spouse 1 owns 100% and spouse 2 owns 100%. This will come into play in our next video where we talk about step up in basis and double step up in basis rules that apply based on which state you're in and how these assets are titled and used. But just know that separate property views jointly held property as 50-50. Community property states view community property as 100%, 100%. This is also motivation for a lot of people to set up trusts because it takes a lot of the guesswork out around which property is joint versus separate. Because, for example, in a state like Alaska, you can set up a community property trust and it's pretty obvious what your intentions are. If you move property into that trust, it's pretty obvious how you want your estate to view that property. So from a calls to action standpoint, it's important to understand which state statutes you fall under so that you can title your assets appropriately. And that's because even if your intention is to leave all of your assets to your spouse, if they're titled separately, whether you're in a separate property state or a community property state, if that state views that property as separately held property, then that property is going to follow your will. And if your will dictates that separately held property goes to somebody not labeled your spouse, then your spouse is going to miss out big time on some assets. However, if assets are titled as joint, those are going to transfer directly to the spouse. So if you have further questions, drop them in the comments below, get in touch on the website, we'll help you get squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.